Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video on Boris Todbringer. Just as a caveat for you guys who are regulars to my channel, this is a re-edited version of Boris's lore taken from my Middenland Lore video. So if you've seen that video already, or you're interested in seeing that video, click on the top right. Otherwise, you guys who have seen that video, you've seen all this information already. You can skip this one and wait for the next Legendary Lord lore video to come out. Okay, thanks very much, guys. So, Boris Todbringer. Technically, his full title is Graf Boris Todbringer. Now, I think that's a title rather than his name, but he's often referred to as Graf Todbringer or Graf Boris, but Graf's often tied into his name, and I think that's a title as opposed to his first name being Graf, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So, Boris Todbringer, the Elector Count, the Grand Duke of Middenland, the Prince of Karaberg, the Protector of the Drakwold, and the Warden of the Middle Mountain, is the Elector Count for Middenland. He's its leader, said to be a brilliant warrior and a great statesman. So Boris Todbringer was married at a very young age, and his first wife was Maria von Richthofen. I think that's how you say it, Richthofen. And she died giving birth to their first son almost a year to the day after they were married. And their son was called Stephen, or Stefan. And Stefan was named heir to the province of Middenland within the sort of second day of his birth. Now, unbeknownst to Stefan, of course, as he's an infant at the time, Boris had also fathered a bastard child at approximately the same time. He'd gotten a lady of the court pregnant, and she'd given birth to a boy named Heinrich. Now, Heinrich and Stefan were almost exactly the same age. In fact, it's said that Heinrich would have been conceived the night before Boris married his wife, Maria. Not very faithful old Boris, but there you go, counts will be counts. And after a while, as these two boys grew up, it became immediately clear that Boris may have made an error. Stefan grew into a drooling, palsied invalid who was prone to fits of extreme violence and mania, and it was very plain that he had something very wrong with him and would not really be able to take over the crown. But Boris, looking to help his son, brought in a doctor who took over this kind of Svengali-like character within the town of Middenheim. He was called the most fake Italian name you can ever imagine, Luigi Pavarotti. And of course, as you might guess, he was from Tilia, the Warhammer version of Italy. Now, Luigi somehow managed to make Stefan a little bit better, but even without his manic fits and just being a bit of a loon and being sort of sickly and not very well, he still wasn't really going to make a great Elector Count. But Heinrich, the bastard child, who'd been elevated to the point of Baron because he was, after all, the son of Boris Todbringer, but he was never, still bastardy is looked down upon within the Warhammer world. It's not unknown that a lord would maybe, say, adopt his bastard son and give him title after that. But this, in all honesty, with Todbringer being a Middenlander, he'd given his word that Stefan was his heir. He was never going to change that, no matter how logical or sensible it may be, because Heinrich was making a fine leader in his own right. He was said to be extremely intelligent, shown great skill and promise at martial pursuits, could command, looked like he could grow up to be a fantastic general. And so Boris had this problem of trying to dice with his two sons, as well as grieving for the loss of his wife. Although not necessarily faithful, he still loved her when he lost her. So this goes on for a while, with the kingdom very worried about who's eventually going to take over. And under some quite mysterious circumstances, his two sons are actually die within quick succession of one another, leaving no one to take over from Boris. At some point, he gets another lady of the court pregnant. At this point, a lot of time has passed. The sons had become virtually fully grown around the time of their passing, and Boris is getting on in years. So around the time of 47, he'd already got another lady of the court pregnant and fathered a bastard daughter this time, called Katrina, and eventually he set about looking to get remarried to try and have a male heir to take over the seat of Elector Count. And his second wife was Elise Niche of Nordland, Annika Elise Niche of Nordland, and she and Boris fell deeply in love with each other. They were married for 10 years, but alas, due to God knows why, maybe the gods just weren't smiling, Ulrich did not favor the marriage, whatever it was, Boris was never able to conceive a child with Elise. And in fact, she herself died 10 years after they were married. So now Boris is heirless. I think his heir at the moment is something like a cousin thrice removed or something like that. It's this chap called Wolfgram, but he's said to be sickly and he tends to spend most of his time in Karabberg, locked away. No one really sees him. No one's really sure what's wrong with him. So that's who his heir is. So he would like to ideally have a son, but Boris is getting on a bit now. He's at least 57 years old, and he doesn't have an heir, and there's no marriage on in the line for him. After a while, having suffered all these losses in the family, lost 2 wives, lost both his sons, it looks like he won't be able to pass on the name Todbringer. He starts to become melancholic and slightly despondent. He starts to take less and less interest in the running of the kingdom, and this melancholy is said to reach a point of feeble-mindedness where he doesn't seem to really care about the running of the kingdom. He just does whatever his advisors say. There's no sort of individual. He doesn't see a fight, at least for the political bureaucracy of running a province. He doesn't see any fights worth having. He'll still go out and lead his men in battle. It seems to be one of the few things he still gets satisfaction out of, just taking out his rage and sadness on the beastmen of the Drakwold and mowing them down. But alas, just through to all his loss, his ability as a leader is said to not be what it once was. Now, throughout this period of him slightly losing interest, tension started to rise up with Karl Franz, the emperor. Now, while Karl Franz's father died, Boris actually put himself up to be emperor amongst the Elector counts. And he did have the support of the Ulrich, which is the head of the Church of Ulrich, who always tends to vote for the Elector count of Middenland no matter what. I don't think in its history, except for maybe the time during the crisis of the Three Emperors, where there was a civil war for many, many years within the empire, Ulrich hasn't voted for the Count of Middenland to be the emperor. So he had that support. One assumes he maybe had support from some of the northern provinces as well, most likely Nordland. I think he came runner-up in the vote, but Karl Franz took it away and went on to become emperor. Since then, there's been some tensions. Karl Franz at one point decreed that mutants weren't a real thing and that these are just poor, sick human beings, whereas the policy in Middenland has always been kill them, they're offspring of chaos. And more often than not, they probably are, but there are some mutants who maybe just have a clubbed foot, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're a spawn of chaos, it just means they have a clubbed foot. But in Middenland, they're sometimes likely just to be dragged out to the woods and left there to be adopted by some beastman clan and maybe turn traitor. So Boris, whose kingdom and province actually looks to hunt mutants, Karl Franz is telling them there's no such thing as mutants, you need to stop it, you're killing human beings, stop that immediately. And the Middenlanders and Boris aren't happy about that decision at all, so that's caused some friction. And Karl Franz is very well aware of this, and he knows that Boris has always been difficult, although he does support the empire when it comes down to it, and he will be there. In terms of their own personal relationship, it's quite fraught, with Karl even being caught commenting that he feels that with sort of Boris's new change of mentality, that, quote, the old fool has finally cracked, just because of all the pain that Boris has gone through and all the trials and tribulations he's gone through, both personally and on the battlefield. Speaking of the battlefield, one of the defining characteristics of Boris Todbringer and his trials and tribulations of life, not just to mention the losses he suffered personally amongst his family, have been on the battlefield against Kazarak One-Eye. Now, Kazarak is probably the most prestigious leader of the beastmen that there has been for a number of years. He is a beastman of rare cunning and intelligence and started to raid all around the Drakwold. At one point, Boris caught up with him and challenged him to a duel. Boris managed to strike him across the eye with his runefang. Now, runefangs are given to the Elector counts of every province, and they're magical weapons forged long ago during the time of Sigmar by the dwarves as a gift to humanity. And as a result of being struck in the eye with this sword, Kazarak, then known as Kazarak One-Eye, never had that eye healed, so it often dribbles with blood and pus just because of the magical nature of the runefang. Now, whereas injury in an eye would be a debilitating thing to a beastman, whereby that single disadvantage of depth perception would have people challenging you all the time and eventually kill you and take your clan off you. That's just the way of the beastman. They don't stand for weakness, much like the natural kingdom itself. However, this injury just enraged Kazarak. It made him a far more fearsome opponent. He would sit down any challenger, and eventually people stopped trying because they realized that this had actually made him just an angrier beastman, not a weaker beastman. And so Kazarak, much after he'd taken the injury from Boris, his clan and his war herd had dispersed, began to regroup and repopulate, as the beastmen always tend to do if they're allowed to survive. So he goes about regathering his forces and eventually comes up with a strategy of several elaborate ambushes around Middenland, all of which are done to tempt Boris out of Middenheim, because Middenheim is a fortress. It's hard to break down. You're unlikely to be able to take Middenheim. It has been done, but it's very difficult to do. And I don't think beastmen themselves have ever even come close to taking Middenheim. It's only ever been, I think, a greenskin war that just overwhelmed them with numbers, and the Skaven came close once, but I think that's about it. He needs to lure Boris out, so he eventually does with all these ambushes, killing the citizens of Middenland. Boris comes out, and this is what his entire new clan has been built to do, to trap Boris Todbringer. And eventually Kazarak catches up with Boris in the heat of the battlefield, throws him from his horse, pins him to the ground, and slowly and deliberately, with the tip of one of his horns, gouges out Boris's right eye. And he takes huge delight in this, sort of laughing manically after he's done it. He lets Boris live because he wants him to live with the shame of having been beaten by Kazarak. And these two have met many times since. They've set their armies against each other many times over the years, and their rivalry is really a rivalry of the ages. It really is a rivalry that defines the age they currently live in the Warhammer world. Now, Boris is set upon killing Kazarak. He wants to have his revenge, but Kazarak's wily and he has the entire Drakwold to hide in. So they fight around each other, and it's even said that Kazarak, with his joy of battle, didn't kill Boris that day that he took his eye, because he actually quite enjoys matching wits with the old general, and it's the only competition Kazarak really has in terms of people matching his martial skill and culling on the battlefield, at least that he's ever encountered in his life wandering the Drakwold. So that's the theory. That's Boris and Kazarak. So Boris at the moment is sitting in Middenheim, despondent but filled with both sadness at his family and his personal losses and the state of his future bloodline, and rage that Kazarak is still alive and allowed to wander the Drakwold. And those are really the two emotions that rule Boris at this point in his life. So he's not probably at his most well-adjusted, but despite that, he's still out there, still leading his troops from the front, and is still a cunning and wily fighter with huge amounts of strength, even for a man as old as 57, which I have to imagine. I imagine he's probably close to 67 now in the current Warhammer timeline, but even that, you have to imagine 67 is unheard of, almost unheard of old age in the Warhammer world for human beings. I don't think healthcare is top of their list of priorities, but who knows? So Boris soldiers on, old man Todbringer, and he keeps fighting the beastmen of the Drakwold and keeping the lands of Middenland safe for his people.